Welcome to this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts, either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And today we have Jack Maher. He is an author of Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. He's an award-winning journalist-turned-novelist. And we'll talk about all the things about journalism, about his writing process, and also about his novel about a colorful Colorado life. Welcome to the show, Jack.
Thank you, Ajay. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it.
You are welcome. Welcome to the show, Jack. Welcome to India in this online form. And I'm sure not just in India, but a lot of people across the globe will benefit from what we are going to talk about. We'll talk about history. We'll talk about writing. We'll talk about art. We'll talk about nostalgia, a lot of things in this book. But before that, let's talk a bit about your journey, your background, so that people know who they are listening to.
Well, of course, I am a former multimedia journalist and TV news executive. I worked for the NBC affiliate in Denver, Colorado, for some 34 years. And I started the morning show here, which was kind of unusual at that time. Nobody really had morning news programming back when I began this in 1980. And by the time I finished up, I realized that we had really made a little bit of history in terms of morning television. We were the top-rated local morning show in the country. And, the only thing people don't really understand when you make morning TV, somebody has to be in there at midnight typing all those scripts for your beautiful anchors to be reading. So I was one of those people on the production side of things, and the hours were just getting a little bit too much for me. And so after a really good career, I retired from broadcasting. And I decided I needed to settle down and try something else. And book writing was that something else.
Absolutely. Book writing was that something else. So from making history to becoming a historical novelist, how this transition happened for you, Jack?
This book, Poppy, is about a man who revolutionized the Denver Art Museum. His name was Eric Douglas. Poppy was sort of the family name, and he happened to be my grandfather. So I'll take you back to 1930. And he was recruited by a woman by the name of Ann Evans. Now, I don't know how many of your listeners and viewers know about the Sand Creek Massacre, but it's an infamous chapter in American history. And the territorial governor who was associated with that massacre of Indians in Sand Creek, his name was Governor Evans. And his daughter, Ann, I think, felt a lot of guilt about being associated with this horrendous event. And so I think she spent her life trying to do good things for the city of Denver. One of those good things was to start the Denver Art Museum. And again, because of her history with the Sand Creek Massacre, she wanted to try to elevate Native American art and the artists who created it. And so she sought out my grandfather, Eric Douglas, and asked him to help start a Native Arts department. Because, Ajay, at the time, there was a lot of concern because of what the American government was doing to Native Americans, putting them on reservations, putting the kids in these schools that they were being sort of trained off of their history and their heritage. There was real concern that their art and their music and their culture was going to be erased. And so Anne wanted to start this specialized department at the museum, fill it with the art made by these Native Americans, and try to show people that, this is worth preserving. These are the first Americans, and we need to elevate that art to the same level as some of the other things that were in the museum at the time. Let's say a beautiful statue from Greece or a French Impressionist painting. And so that was Eric's task, and he was well suited for it because he had grown up in a household and a family who loved Native Americans.
Absolutely. So, how did you find about all these things? Just one fine, did you grew up with this story, or did you came across this story all of a sudden? And everyone comes across a lot of stories within their household, but not everyone writes a story. How did this all these things, all inspiration, motivation, understanding of this whole part of history, as well as about St. Creeks and everything?
Well, Poppy was sort of on the edges of my consciousness growing up in Denver. And really, I didn't know a whole lot about him or about his life. And shame on me, but I was just a kid. And my only memory, to be honest, of this man, because he died when I was very young, I was only 2. But I have this very hazy memory of this one-armed giant, because towards the end of his life, bone cancer required the amputation of one of his arms, and he was very sick towards the end. And really, that's about all I knew until out of the blue, the Denver Art Museum somehow tracked me down at the TV station, and they knew I was one of his last descendants. And he said, I don't know if you know this, Jack, but we have a society dedicated to your grandfather, to Eric Douglas, to Poppy. And we would love for you to come and give a lecture about him to the Douglas Society. They actually still had a society in his name. Well, I was terrified because I really didn't have a whole lot of information about him other than a few things my grandmother had said. She really didn't talk about this part of her life. And so I did a very quick cramming session for this 90-minute lecture that I kind of stumbled through to talk about his life and his work. And I felt badly about it. And so at the end of that lecture, that's when I decided, this man needs something a lot more than what I was able to just pull together. He needs a book. And so I spent 2 years researching all the things that he had done with the museum. And I'll tell you, if I can give you just a little bit of background that was interesting.
Yes.
So he really got a love affair developed for the Navajo, the Hopi, the Santa Clara, the Pueblo Indians, because of his father. His father was an Episcopalian minister, believe it or not, and he had dedicated his life to music and to this beautiful type of music that you will sometimes hear in Episcopal churches and even Catholic churches called plain song. And it's unaccompanied music that his father thought could open windows to heaven. And he wanted to bring this music to the masses through a hymnal. Well, he worked so hard that he collapsed one day. And his superiors said, you need to get yourself better before you go back to, doing any more of this music stuff. And so he went out on his own into the Southwest, into the Four Corners region, we call it, in southwestern Colorado. He spent 6 months with just a bedroll and a horse. And he, during the course of getting rehabilitated through fresh air and just sleeping out under the stars, he got acquainted with these tribes people, with these Native Americans, and in particular the Hopi, who kind of adopted him and made him a blood brother. Well, this is where the love of the Native Americans started, was with Poppy's father. And he kind of transmitted it to Eric. And so when Eric had this chance to start the Native Arts Department at the Denver Art Museum, he jumped on it because their home up in Evergreen, which is west of Denver, was populated with baskets and weaving and beautiful paintings, sand paintings. And so he already had a lot of the knowledge that he needed to start this Native Arts Department. And he put it to good use. So in elevating this art, he not only, made sure that people understood its value, but he pioneered some interesting techniques how to show it. If you go to a museum today, anywhere in the world, it's pretty interactive. And Eric Douglas, Poppy, was one of the men who pioneered these techniques, putting a vase, a seed jar on top of a pedestal, arranging lighting around some ceremonial masks so they looked like they were lit by firelight, running a tube up the side of a wall with compressed air so the feathers on the mask would ripple. I mean, these were really advanced techniques for the 1930s, and they are still in use today. So there was a lot to his life and to his legacy. And that's why I wrote this book. I wanted to make sure that he was not lost to history.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we'll come to this museum part, but first, he was also part of World War II, if I understand. And then how did that thing happen? Means first the World War II came, or the museum came later on, and how did that? How did you discover all this part when you did not know too much? And it is very difficult to put all those things into perspective. Tell us a bit about that back.
Of course. Well, I went to the Denver Art Museum when I told them I wanted to write this book, and they opened their archives to me. And I'll never forget, I was expecting like maybe a cardboard box or two. They kept bringing out little trucks full of these boxes of his letters and his technical papers and his diaries. And you've got to understand that the family, the Douglas family, they had thousands of objects that they had purchased from these Native American artists over time. And they donated pretty much all of it to the Denver Art Museum. So there wouldn't be a Native Arts department without their contributions. So in the course of going through all of these boxes, I also uncovered his World War II connection. So it turned out after the war broke out, the Army needed people who were good at administration. And when they, saw that he had this experience at the museum, they tapped him to start a hospital in New Hebrides in the Pacific. And so I actually had a telegram where he got his orders, and it was a top secret assignment where he was going to take over 100 nurses from Colorado and surrounding regions, take them by rail to San Francisco, and then by transport ship to New Hebrides, where they opened this hospital. And so in the course of his time with these nurses over there, he pioneered something else, which I think you'll find interesting. Remember, I mentioned he grew up in a home full of art, but also music from his father. And it was religious music for the most part. Well, a lot of these soldiers and Marines and sailors that were being treated at the hospital, they had, horrific injuries, but not all of them you could see. Back then, they called it shell shock. Today, we would call it PTSD. And Eric, sort of insightfully, realized that the way to treat some of these hidden injuries was through music. And so he wrote back to his dad in Evergreen and said, "You know what, Pop?" That's what he called him. "Pop, I would love for you to send me some of these musical arrangements for this chorus of patients I want to put together at this hospital. And let's see how it goes." So he was using music therapy to treat these traumatized, soldiers and sailors and whatnot. So he I think on many, many levels, was an extraordinary man. And he continued to try to help administer from this hospital in the Pacific, the Denver Art Museum responsibility as well. So he had a lot on his plate. I don't know where he got all the energy, but he did. And these nurses, they developed a real friendship with Poppy. And, after the war, they kept having reunions up until his death from bone cancer.
Absolutely, absolutely. So how did he get found for this artwork? The art museum work by, this by Anne or Jane, you said.
Anne Evans was her name. Yep. She recruited him, and he started out as a docent, and that was basically an unpaid volunteer, but she knew of him and his knowledge of Native American art. And he was just so impressive with all of the energy and knowledge that he just kept going up and up in the ranks until he was in charge of this department. This innovation I've talked about, he not only applied it at the Denver Art Museum, but also at the Golden Gate Expo in 1939, when they opened the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. And he paired up with another museologist, is what I call them, in New York. His name was Rene de Harnecourt at the Museum of Modern Art. And both these men had sort of similar tracks. They were very creative in how they wanted to display things. And so they opened this expo in San Francisco in 39 to rave reviews. They brought in demonstrators from all the different Native American cultures to show how they made a sand painting or how they could create a pot. And it was a real hit. And they repeated it in 1941 in New York at the Museum of Modern Art at an exhibit that was actually attended by Eleanor Roosevelt. And she was equally impressed. And I'll give you one more example of the creativity these men had. They brought in these artisans from Arizona who were able to recreate kivas. And some of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with the kiva. It's an underground ceremonial chamber that is used by the Hopi and other cultures. And they made theirs a facsimile in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Imagine that. So visitors would enter these ceremonial chambers and they had pictographs that were on the walls. Again, just brilliant ways to make this art accessible and interesting to all the people who came to view it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we'll come to the book. I want to understand a bit more about the art museum part of it. But first, one curious thing I have in my mind is that how did this whole understanding about your grandfather miss your dad or your mom, your parents?
That is a really good question, and unfortunately a little bit of a painful one, but I will answer it. So my family, to be totally honest, Ajay, was somewhat dysfunctional. And we had a very little family that was kind of broken. We were affected by alcoholism and by mental illness. And so my folks, their challenge was getting through every single day, making sure the rent was paid and that we had, food to eat. And it was a pretty hard, challenge for them to raise my brother and I. And so, honestly, the world of Eric Douglas and Native American art was pretty darn low on the list. My mom knew about this, my dad a little bit, but honestly, it was almost more of a case of just survival than anything. And that's really why I didn't know a lot about this other side of my family. And I would tell you something else. My dad died of a heart attack when I was just 13. And my mom was just not equipped to raise, two boys on her own with all the challenges she had. And so Eric's wife, Frida, we called her Baba, she knew we were in trouble. And this woman who had spent a full life with Eric and with the museum, and she supported him when he was away at the hospital in World War II. She should have been enjoying a comfortable retirement, but when she realized that we needed her, she came in and took over. And I would not be here talking to you today if it weren't for her. And I am so grateful to Baba, as we called her. But again, that whole section of her life, she also kept quiet. I think she was more interested in stabilizing us and making sure we had a pretty good childhood, which we did, thanks to her.
Absolutely, absolutely. Many stories within stories. And this is what life is all about. Some stories are there, they come. They will come to the world at their own time, own pace.
Yeah.
This is the way it is. Just the way you see, even in St. Creek's case, the father had a different way of thinking, the daughter had a different way of finding redemption, we will call it. So that's the way it is. And we somehow become part of that whole story. You became a journalist, you were telling stories for so many other stories,
There's a lot of wisdom in what you were saying, and I really don't think I've looked at it quite this way. This is fascinating. Thank you.
You are a journalist, I understand it. And that is where you get a chance. Sometimes when your story gets a bit, different, you get a chance to tell many stories. Scott has different plans to tell it. I've also spent several years in journalism. I also feel it in that same manner. And that is why that is why I get this chance of telling stories in this way, more than, and it's a blessing in its own way from God Almighty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. You may have had this challenge too. I don't know if you have had this, but when you're in broadcasting, you're taught to write a certain way. And at the NBC station in Denver, our mantra was write like people talk, which basically meant short declarative sentences. And we always had the one breath rule. You couldn't have a sentence that was longer than one breath, so your anchor wouldn't run out of oxygen. And so I kind of had to unlearn all of that broadcast style of writing to be able to write this novel. And it was a really wonderful challenge. But, I was back to looking up synonyms and trying to get descriptive passages about, the different locales that he was part of. So it's been a really good journey for me. But in the process, I think I've unlearned TV news, so I don't think I could ever go back.
Absolutely. And no use of going back when you are seeing the world in a different way, explaining the world in a different way, explaining about Native American art. So how did you, get down to writing the book with all those challenges? Especially, how did it change your view of, of Native American art itself because of your grandfather's legacy?
Well, I'll tell you, in writing this book, I had really a powerful motivator. My sweet Becky, my wife of almost 49 years, passed away of a brain aneurysm. And it was very sudden and very unexpected. And, when you suffer loss and you have grief, you have a couple of choices to make. You can either sit in the darkness or you can mine it for gold. And I chose the latter. And so this project of writing this book was a way for me to deal with the grief of this unexpected loss of Becky. And I just plunged into it. I not only did the research I told you about at the museum, I went up to the family home in Evergreen where I did more research. And I also camped where they camped, because keep in mind, they went on horseback and mule train to a lot of these places to visit these reservations. And I just wanted to get a sense of what it was like. So I went to places like Monument Canyon and Hopi Land and some of the other places that they visited. And I slept out under the stars, just like they did. And that certainly helped. But I think as much as I understood the Native Americans through my research, I understood myself on a much deeper level than ever before in terms of my resilience. Because honestly, Ajay, I could have fallen apart, after Becky's death. And I chose instead to do something that would bring light and understanding. And so that is what I've tried to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Who is this book for? Who have you written this book for, Jack?
Honestly, at first, I just wanted it to be for my kids and my grandchildren. I have 3 children who are now grown and 2 grandchildren, and I wanted them to know about Poppy and his legacy. But by extension, I have come to realize that a lot of people perhaps don't know about this part of Colorado history. I like to say it's a piece of Colorado history you never knew and will never forget. And so whether you live here or you live anywhere in the world, if you have an interest in Native American art and the beautiful things they create, and some of the artists who were friends of Poppy and who I write about, I just want people that have curiosity to enjoy it. Towards the end of his life, one of the last things Poppy said in the hospital to my aunt, who recorded a history for the museum, he told her, "Eve, I want you to remember just one thing. Never stop learning." And that is something that I think a lot of people could benefit from. And this book is a way to maybe help them learn something they didn't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Tell us a bit about that art section. Means, uh, how has it come about? If someone goes, what do they see about Native American art? And what does it tell about Poppy?
You know, if you go into the Denver Art Museum today, you will find a lot of objects that he and his dad collected. There are so many, they can't keep them all out. You know, a lot of them are in the back of the Denver Art Museum in the archives. And so they rotate them in and out. They just concluded a special exhibit called Weaving a Foundation, in which they traced the roots of the Douglas family and of Poppy and what he had done there. But I think if he were here instead of me talking, the one thing he would want you to know is that this is not necessarily art that is, you know, in the past. It is still being made today. And if you go to any center of Native American life in the Western US, you will find artists making incredible things that are totally new and fresh and beautiful. And I would encourage people who might have the opportunity to visit these places to support these artists. That was one of the things that that Poppy really tried to do during his time, was to make sure that they had a livelihood and an income at a time when there was a lot of struggle, and there is still a lot of struggle. The Denver Art Museum is very good about interspersing these new works with some of the older works that were collected by my grandfather and his dad. And if I could give you one other example of how he was innovative in the way he showed up this art, it was a little controversial and definitely a product of its time. But there were a lot of textiles that were collected by Poppy. And rather than just stick them on a mannequin, and we're talking leggings and moccasins and deerskin dresses, beautiful pieces, rather than have them on a mannequin, he thought, let's put them on models, live models that would walk a runway and show how this fabric moved on the human form. Well, the controversial part, he used white models to showcase the Native American art. But there was a strategy to it, because he realized the people that would support the museum, or that were supporters of it, were a lot of women's groups, a lot of white women's groups in Denver. And so that's how he started this fashion show, as he called it. And it proved to be such a hit, and it generated such a response. He ended up putting it on hundreds of times before he died throughout the United States. I mean, there were shows all over the country. And part of my research in doing this book, I uncovered the fact that there were films made of some of these shows, very 1940s, very 1950s type shows with these models in this attire. And I understand that there is a surviving film clip or two, but I haven't been able to find him yet. But I hope to at one point. They definitely wouldn't fly today. I mean, you can clearly say this was appropriation, but that's not how he looked at it. He just thought this was a way to make this art accessible to women of influence who would in turn, support these artists and buy their work. So in one way, it was kind of brilliant.
Absolutely. So, do you often go to this part of the museum now? Have you taken your children? How have you explained to them the strong connection with what they are seeing with the family itself?
I do. And it's always a joy, because my youngest granddaughter, Gracie, is at the University of Denver right now. And it appears at the moment, you know how kids can change their minds, she may be on an art history track. Isn't that something? And I think it's because of the influence that I've given her because of, what Eric Douglas had done. So yes, I do take my children and my grandchildren to the museum, and I proudly point out the pieces that have, Poppy's name to them, and I tell a little bit about his story. And this book is helping to tell the story as well. There's also another museum that is west of Denver, which I've made reference to. It's the family home. And it's a beautiful log home that is located in Evergreen. That's an hour west of Denver. And it's now called the Haiwan Heritage Park. And it's where Eric and his family grew up. And today, school children from all over Colorado come and visit this family home. And they learn about the Douglas family, about Poppy, and about their love for the Native American artists and art. And they learn about that history. And so, my gosh, what better way to have this legacy in two different places? I guess three if you count my book. And a lot of the kids that go there, they say it's the best learning they've ever done.
Absolutely, absolutely. Does it ever occur to you that your book creates that bridge between, your great grandfather, your grandfather, somewhere some things were, differently, and then it take not only it creates a bridge for your own children, but that's what you intended to, but also for the future generations, and actually brings the native art in the forefront.
I absolutely think that. And, before I started writing, Poppy and his dad and a lot of the Douglas family are buried in a very historic cemetery called Fairmount on the edge of Denver. And I went there and I told them, I hope it's okay that I'm writing this, but I don't want you lost. I don't want any of you lost to history. And so I asked their permission before I started writing, and I have felt their presence during this entire process. And it's not in a ghostly way, but in a very supportive and warm and loving way. And I sure did my best to capture their life. I will tell you one other thing. I made this a novel as opposed to nonfiction. Pretty much everything in here in the book is true. There's only a couple of places where I had to use my imagination to fill in gaps. And I'm going to give you just one quick example. I had my great-grandfather's diary from 1921. They had taken a mule train through Monument Canyon, and they were on their way to, visit Native American artists. Well, my grandfather's diary was pretty good, but he left out a few things. So this particular entry said, today was a good day. We made 10 miles, beautiful sunset. We found good grass, good water, and we rescued a mule from a pine tree, period. And that was just crazy. So I just, there was no other reference to this rescue or how the mule got into the pine tree or how they got the mule out of the pine tree. So I had to use my imagination to fill that gap in. And it kind of made for an entertaining part of the book that's in the front half. But everything in it happened, and all the people in it are real.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's all about being real and being showing about things that is part of us, all real. Though it looks like to be history, but very much in the present. There is so much to learn about all these things from you, Jack, and I'm sure a lot of people would want to connect with you, learn more from you, about your Poppy, and also about the book. So tell us what is the best way for them to connect with you?
Well, you know what? If you just search on any search engine, my name, Jack Maher, Maher, and the word Poppy, Poppy, it should pop up. But I also have a website that has some multimedia on it, including pictures of the Douglas family. I do an excerpt from the book for you there. And I have a story from my multimedia experience where I take you to the Haiwan Homestead Museum. And I show you the kids that go there to learn and drop in on one of their lessons. It's a bit of a mouthful, so I apologize. I'm sure you'll link it up. It is sandgoatmanorpublishing.com. Again, sandgoatmanorpublishing, all one.com.
Wonderful. With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of the KAJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.